Well, next week, Joe Biden is set to name the search committee that'll help him find his running mate. According to the Washington Post, the presumptive Democratic nominee will name a panel of advisors to help him find his potential VP pick. Biden has said that he tends to select a woman for the role and that he expects to have a list of 2 or 3 contenders by July. That's when the Democratic National Convention was originally scheduled. And regardless of which woman Joe Biden will pick as his running mate, she won't be the first, as you know, in American history. A new article for CBS News looks at the significance of past women who have been named on the ticket. The headline of that article is Ferraro and Palin, what it meant to have a woman running mate then and what it would mean for Biden now. I want to bring in CBS News political unit associate producer Sarah Ewall-Wice and CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns, who both authored that article. They join me now from New York City. So Caitlin, I want to go back to the 80s and sort of look at the first VP pick on the ticket who was a woman. What was the political climate back there in the 80s that allowed it to happen?
Hi, Rena. Well, we had a lot of fun kind of going through all this archival footage from over 3.5 decades ago when Geraldine Ferraro was picked as the running mate for Walter Mondale. And it was really interesting because in the 1980 election, we started to see the emergence of what we now call the gender gap, which means that we started to see women voters choosing a different candidate than male voters. Of course, that's something that's defined presidential elections since. And when you look at the 1984 election where Geraldine Ferraro was nominated as vice president, this was something that was more pronounced and an effort by the campaign to really kind of tap into women voters who were becoming a really strong voting bloc. And so Mondale knew that he was at the time really trailing behind incumbent Ronald Reagan and needed some kind of boost for his campaign, as he put it in a book that he titled later, that he really needed to change the game. And he actually consulted his wife in looking for who he should pick as a vice presidential candidate, and his wife was one of the people that really encouraged him to pick a woman to kind of break out of what she called the white male mold. And so he really cast a big net and a variety of different candidates, including Ferraro and actually then San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein, of course, who's the senior senator now from California. And so by bringing in Ferraro and eventually nominating her, he knew, Mondale did at the time, that this would be something that would make history, that it would open the doors, as he put it, for women down the line. And when she took to the stage in San Francisco in the 1984 Democratic Convention, you could just feel kind of the energy of the people in the crowd, a lot of them women wiping tears from their eyes, knowing that she was making history at that moment. And Ferraro herself, in a later documentary, kind of spoke about the gravity of that moment. And she actually told her daughters before going on to that stage at the convention that she did not want to shed any tears, that this was a position that needed strength and that she needed to convey that. So it was interesting to kind of see how much has changed, but how little has changed over the 3.5 decades since she was nominated.
So true. How much has changed and how little has changed. Sarah, when you look at her movements throughout that campaign trail and that season, what was she like on the campaign trail? How was she received?
Oh, well, like Caitlin said, I mean, starting with the convention, there was a huge jolt of momentum and excitement. She took her campaign across the country where she was greeted with that same excitement and momentum, and women all wanting to come out and see the first major party ticket vice presidential nominee. But obviously it was covered differently than past campaigns were. Obviously there was a greater emphasis and coverage of her appearance. They talked about her blonde hair, pearls, and her pocketbook. They also had this conversation about how she could interact with her running mate that her predecessors never had to deal with, whether she and Mondale could hold hands and raise them like previous candidates had done, or whether they should wave their hands and keep physical distance from each other. And there was also the questions about what she was asked on the campaign trail. She was very direct. She would call out questions. She pointed out that she did not believe that a man would get questions like, "Are you tough enough to push the button?" During the debate, she inevitably was the first woman to appear on a nationally televised debate stage. And not only was she up against the Republican candidate, she was up against the current Vice President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, and she was praised a lot for that performance. There was talk about how she called him out directly for his, quote, patronizing attitude. And there was also a comical headline that I remember reading that she was compared to Eliza Doolittle in By George, She's Got It. It was the first time anyone had seen it. But there was also questions about her experience and whether she had experience in foreign policy. The other thing that came up on the campaign trail in a greater focus was her family, and specifically her spouse. Originally, her husband was not going to release his tax returns. That became a huge problem on the campaign trail. She was asked about it nonstop. Eventually, they did release financial records, which raised more questions about disclosures when she was in the House. And it really dragged her family for quite some time. She held a 2-hour press conference about those financial records. But Ronald Reagan's campaign manager even said she was becoming a drag on the campaign. After the campaign ended, obviously, she lost, her and Mondale lost that campaign, but later interviews learned that it was a Republican effort really to bring down what was a perceived threat and the enthusiasm surrounding her. After the election, a couple years later, she was asked about it specifically, was this all worth it? And she said, absolutely, yeah. It opened the door for women and we made the difference.
It certainly has opened the door for women. You know, Caitlin, when you look back at the 2008 campaign, John McCain, of course, picking Sarah Palin as his running mate, his VP, and he said he later came to regret that choice. How did things go so wrong for Palin?
That's right. While Ferraro talked about her nomination opening the door for women, it would be nearly a quarter century until the next woman, the second woman, came to be a vice presidential pick. Sarah Palin really was plucked from obscurity. She came into the vetting process late, and this was, according to the lawyer in charge of McCain's vetting process, a way to really reach out to women voters and expand the appeal of the ticket. Remember, at the time, John McCain was facing a lot of different challenges. First, at 72, he was the oldest person seeking the nomination for the first time, or seeking election to the White House for the first time. He was also criticized by evangelicals and more conservative members of the Republican Party, and he was facing a candidate in Barack Obama whose candidacy was historic as the first African-American Democratic nominee. And so he was looking for a jolt to his own campaign, and they selected Palin. Of course, we know well that her downfall was well documented and what kind of happened throughout that campaign, but I think what people forget is when she was introduced and when she made that speech to the convention in 2008, to the Republican National Convention, she really wowed the crowd. She was electric, and she got a lot of praise for that performance. Yeah. And in fact, the ticket got a short bump out of that. Of course, that wouldn't last, and they went on to lose that 2008 campaign, and we kind of know what happened from there. But it's important to note that at the time, too, while Barack Obama did very well among women, the McCain-Palin ticket won white women, and that's a trend that we saw in 2016 with Donald Trump's election.
Yeah, it certainly is. I want to thank you both for joining us. A fascinating look back and a reminder of what it's meant to have a woman as a VP on the ticket. I want to thank you both, Caitlin Huey-Burns and Sarah Ewall-Wice.